Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. Earlier this season, we looked at Russian documentary film in the Putin years. This week, we're back on the non-fiction, but the scope is much wider. Among his many achievements, the Irish filmmaker Mark Cousins is perhaps best known for his sprawling documentaries charting the history of cinema. The Story of Film and Odyssey, originally released in 2011, and Women Make Film, a new road movie through cinema from 2019. Now Mark is back with a third entry in this pantheon, the story of documentary film. Like its predecessors, it's an epic undertaking with 16 hour-long chapters running from the 19th century to the present day and raging all across the globe. With typical enthusiasm and insight, Mark guides us through some of the political, aesthetic and formal factors that have shaped documentary, with examples ranging from the canonical to the deliciously obscure. Chapters of the film have begun screening at festivals, including in Berlin and Cannes. I was lucky enough to see a couple of them myself recently at the Golden Apricot Festival in Armenia. This week, I sat down with Mark for a fittingly wide-ranging conversation about how he approaches these long-form odysseys, his personal experiences in Eastern Europe, from visiting Moscow during perestroika to watching films in bomb shelters in Sarajevo, and some of his favourite filmmakers from the region, including Latvian legends Hertz Frank and Juris Podniks, the Czech trailblazer Helena Trestikova, and Bulgaria's Nevena Tosha. You can find a link to our own collection of documentary films to watch on Klassiki now in the show description. Mark, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. So, this latest gargantuan film of yours, the latest in this ongoing collection of stories, of histories of film, the story of documentary film.
Yeah.
There's obviously far too much for us to get through in one short podcast episode. I think a whole series of podcast episodes would not be enough. And I've been lucky enough to see two of the chapters which deal with the 1980s, but obviously there's a lot more that I'm yet to have the pleasure of discovering.
Yeah.
But I think that, first of all, maybe we can just speak in more general terms about what the process is like for you when you embark on one of these epic films. So this one, if I'm not mistaken, is 16 hours in total, 16 hour-long chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you don't just sit down and start from kind of zero. You're drawing on kind of decades of cinephilia and experience and so on. But I mean, what's the process by which you begin to map out something this ambitious?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I've been interested in documentary for a long time. I started directing documentaries when I was 22, so that was a while ago. I did a book with Kevin MacDonald for Faber and Faber on the history of documentary in the mid-90s. So that's over 30 years ago. So mapping out is exactly the right phrase. I've got a big sheet of paper. I'm stretching my arms out full. It's like 2 meters wide by 1 meter that way. And along the top of that huge sheet of paper, I wrote the decades, the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Along the side, I wrote the parts of the world, including the Soviet bloc, etc. And then I filled it in. And it took about 2 days. And there were about 900 films on that big map. And I stuck it on the wall here in my edit suite. And that was the kind of, through 5 years of filmmaking and editing, that was the kind of roadmap almost. It looks like the London Tube map in a way. And that kept me sane. So I could see, as you say, you've seen the 1980s. I could see when you get to the 1980s, there's an explosion of documentary filmmaking, particularly, of course, at the end of the Soviet Empire in
Mm.
Poland, etc. So it was a really good way of me visualizing this, shall we say, Odyssey through documentary film.
I've actually seen in another interview of yours that I was watching, a video interview. I've seen you hold up the piece of paper
Yeah,
that you're. It's actually several pieces of paper stuck together with sellotape,
it is.
from what I
Yes,
could tell. So
yes,
that initial 900 film
yeah.
splurge, that was all things that you already were aware of, or already kind of familiar
Yes,
with.
mostly like this is my third and definitely my final history of cinema, but I only tend to make these things. The first was story of film and Odyssey, the second was women make film, and now story of documentary film. I only tend to make them when my head is bursting full of films that I want to talk about. It feels like a pressure cooker ready to explode. So I don't start, as you rightly say, I don't start from zero. I start when I've almost made the film in my head. I'm sure you've heard this word hyperphantasic. It's a word that
Mm.
neuroscientists use, and it refers to people who can visualize things pretty clearly, even though they're not literally in front of their eyes. And I think, hyperphantasic in that I could kind of see this very large film before we started shooting anything. And the opposite is aphantasic. It's for people, if I say to you now, visualize a margarita pizza, and if you can't visualize it, then you're aphantasic.
Well, I can certainly do the pizza. I'm not sure I can do the 16-hour film. Uh, and maybe you can't. Maybe this is the wrong kind of question. But like, why do you think that your brain was bursting with documentary films in particular? Was Why do you think that this was the pressure that was building?
Number of reasons. I mean, my unfortunately my brain it bursts with lots of things. It can be quite irritating at times. But on the documentary front, I think documentary has been the ne'er-do-well art form, undervalued, in by cinephiles, I think. I think people think of documentary as journalism or reportage, which of course it is, but half of all films ever made have been documentaries. And documentary isn't a genre like the musical or the western or the road movie. It's many genres. The
Mm.
essay film, the music film, the portrait film, the campaigning film, the propaganda film, etc., etc. And so it's like a multiverse, and it blurs into fiction cinema very much. Jean-Luc Godard said all films are documentaries. And so it's a fascinating, huge terrain. It's a kind of terra incognita, I think, for a lot of people. We know what the classics of the genre, the documentary genre are, but there's so much else to discover. And I wanted to go out and discover and reveal and celebrate this multiverse.
So when you have your matrix of decades and regions of the world, and one of those squares is blank or a little
Yeah,
sparse looking,
yeah.
do you go looking for ways to fill in that piece of the puzzle?
Exactly. That's the exact purpose for the piece of paper. If you
Right.
look at Egypt in the 1940s and you see no films in that bit of the sheet of paper, it's absolutely imperative that I go looking for them exactly as you
Right.
describe. And in that case, there weren't really, I mean, there were very few Egyptians with cameras making documentary films. Fiction cinema was doing very well in Egypt at that period, but documentary less so. It's a way of challenging your own ignorance
Mm.
and really making sure that you're not neglecting work because it hasn't arrived in your inbox. So that's one of the key. Every time I do something, I always say my ignorance is my best friend. You have to fill in the gaps in your knowledge. And so the sheet of paper helps do that.
I mean, switching slightly towards the Klassiki remit, which is Eastern Europe, the
Sure,
Caucasus, and Central Asia. Obviously, it
sure.
would be a ridiculous and slightly self-defeating question to ask something like, "What is Eastern Europe's role in the story of documentary film?"
Hmm.
And hopefully, some of the specific examples that we might get into in a sec would start to answer that question.
Hmm.
Um, but I just wondered whether maybe framing it in terms of your kind of subjective approach to this story, I mean,
Not very subjective, I don't think, much less subjective than a lot of people who talk about this that only talk about American films or French films, so it's hopefully less subjective than most.
well, your subjectivity is probably different from from that of
Exactly.
most people.
Exactly.
But I mean, trying to frame that question in a manageable way,
Yeah.
were there any countries or figures or periods that particularly kind of came to fresh light for you in the process
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
making this? I mean, you've been engaging with Eastern European cinema as with cinema from all over for a very long time. So I won't kind of
Sure.
ask you what you learned about Eastern Europe from the film, but were there connections, say, that came to light in the process of mapping this out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've got, I think, sort of between 50 and 55 films from Eastern Europe in this project. And the first thing you notice is the high proportion of female directors,
Right,
much
yeah.
higher than other parts of the world. We know that because, the Soviet Empire had certain policies, which we can criticize, of course, but certain policies of, gender equality. So it's no surprise to come across Hilka Mittelwitz or any of the great female directors, Kristina Grishkielowska from Poland in the 60s. What a brilliant filmmaker. So there's that. And then you can see other things. We know that in the 1920s and early 30s, we're seeing Soviet and Russian and Ukrainian filmmakers really trying to invent modernity.
Hmm.
I'm thinking famous filmmakers like Dziga Vertov, etc. They're trying to, challenge the language of cinema itself. You see that. And then, of course, the Stalin era, things get very flat and there's nothing very inventive happening. But then you come to particularly, the 60s in Serbia, the 80s in Poland, for example, as you would expect around the Solidarity movement. There's huge energy in the documentary scene in the 80s in Poland. So this is all stuff that we would expect, but it's still exciting. For a long time, I've said that my favorite documentary filmmaker is Hertz Frank
Hmm.
from Latvia, and I corresponded with him towards the end of his life when he was living in Israel by then. And I always said that my favorite film of his was 10 Minutes Older. But now I would say his 1987 film, The Last Judgment, is perhaps his best film. So this is a kind of discovery for me. I'd seen it years ago and that it hadn't impacted me. And now when I look at it, as you know, it's about a guy on death row who's killed people. He's deeply contrite. It's like a Dostoevsky novel. And he says, I love people. I even love the people who will put me up against a wall and shoot me. That deep humanity
Hmm.
that you get in this film and in Latvian cinema in general in this period, I think, touches me deeply. So that for me has, uh, as a result of making this long film, that film, The Last Judgment, has gone very near the top of my list of great documentaries.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk more about Frank maybe when we get into some of the individual chapters of the film. And Frank is someone who's, part of a Soviet and then post-Soviet documentary tradition that goes back, to the 60s in a really important way.
Sure,
So
sure.
he links several of these decades, these chapters. Thinking about, the earlier decades, to say the 1920s, I think a lot of
Yeah,
people will be familiar with the likes of Dziga Vertov and the likes of this kind of Soviet avant-garde and its importance in developing not just fiction but non-fiction cinema. And like you say, from the very beginning, there were a disproportionately higher number of female filmmakers
yeah,
involved in it. I'm thinking of someone like Esfir Shub.
yeah.
Uh,
Fantastic.
and
Yeah,
and also Vertov's wife and
yeah,
editor Elizaveta
yeah,
Svilova.
yeah.
In Vertov's great film Man with a Movie Camera, we literally see her
We
cutting
do.
the footage together in a
Yes.
nice mise on a beam moment. So
Yeah.
so right from the beginning, well, not the 20s isn't the beginning, but right from the early period, there is this kind of canonical Soviet Eastern European involvement in the development of documentary film. And then you say that in the Stalin period, it's a bit of a it gets a bit of a desert in terms of interesting or quality
Yeah.
documentary. But then in the post-war era, we
Hmm.
start to, from what I understand, I haven't seen these episodes, these chapters yet of the film, but we start to kind of open up into more of the Eastern Bloc countries, and you refer to this as the river becoming a delta.
Yes.
Can you explain maybe what you mean by that phrase, the river becoming the delta in the 1960s in
Things
documentary
opened
film?
out. More people had cameras in their hands. The means of production were more available to more types of human beings. So by this stage, more African filmmakers are starting to make films. By the end of the 60s, you've got Japan, you've got the masterpieces from India, etc., and in the former Soviet Empire as well. Like in the 60s. I'm thinking of Navina Tosheva in Bulgaria and Peleshian, of course, in Armenia, and on and on and on. These filmmakers are released from the heavy hand of Stalinism, but both Stalinist form and content. And they are, and look in Serbia, for example, look at Zelmir Zilnik. These people are making what you could call grassroots films in a way, not heavily state controlled, not a message from top down. They're trying to say, okay, so we think this Soviet world is a utopia. Why are there so many unemployed people? Why is there such melancholy in factory life in Bulgaria? Why is homelessness such a problem? So these filmmakers are doing this, but they're doing it in the spirit of a kind of visual poetics. In the Western world, of course, we had cinema verite, and filmmakers in America and France and Canada, etc., in the 60s were saying, this is raw. I'm not interfering here. I'm just going to
Yeah.
follow a salesman. I'm just going to follow JFK. I'm just going to, if you're Fred Wiseman, I'm just going to look at an institution. But the Soviet Empire, Soviet bloc filmmakers were admitting and celebrating the poetics of the medium, as well as addressing, let's say, the lies about the utopia of communism.
I think that word poetic is very important in certain kind of contexts here. So I referred to Hertz Frank's work stretching back into the 60s. In the 60s is, in another part of the Soviet Empire, we have this flourishing of what's known as Baltic poetic documentary, of which
Absolutely.
Frank was one of the progenitors.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's a huge other topic. But I think in that context, the use of the word poetry or poetic was precisely as a rejoinder to the communist context in which they were working, because it was through poetry that they could arrive at a more unvarnished kind of reality, a deeper reality. Whereas in the West, it was that push towards verite and rawness, which was, the same kind of search for a deeper glimpse at reality was framed differently. I'd love to hear more about this Bulgarian filmmaker who I'm not familiar with, Tosheva.
Yes.
Could you
I've only
tell us a
got one
little?
of her. I think she made, I can't remember, I think she made maybe 15 or 20 films. The one that I've looked at is called Measurements from 1975. It is set in a valley. And so it's a portrait of valley life. And, in art and culture and theater, there are many people who use, novelists, etc., who use a valley as a metaphor, as a way, as a kind of symbol of an imprisonment. You can't see beyond the edges of the hills. And Bellatar, of course, did that in one of his films. And she does this here. So it's a portrait on the surface. It's a portrait of people working in this valley. And there's I think it's a coal mine or a steel smelting factory or something. I can't remember which, but her use of music is really melancholic, and the editing sense. I don't know if she edited her own films, but the editing is associative, and there's a real feeling of, there's a Irish playwright J.M. Singh, and he had a play called In the Shadow of the Glen, and her film could have been called In the Shadow of the Glen. And I'm going back. I was in Bulgaria recently, and I'm going back again in the autumn, because the Story of Documentary Film has been bought for Bulgarian theatric release, which is very nice. And I think the Bulgarian filmmakers are so interesting. Uh, and when you think of, I'm sure you've seen the mosquito problems and other stories by Andrei Puanov from 2007, and it's one of the great documentaries, again Bulgarian. And what's great about it is it looks as if it's going to be about one thing, like mosquito problems, and we see trucks spraying, you know, some kind of gas that'll kill the mosquitoes, and then it jumps to something completely different, and then a third thing that's completely different. So this poetics that you find, we're searching for it everywhere, all around the world, but you do find it in the former Soviet sphere. Uh, and it could be because people are trying to disguise their message. And this is what's said about Iranian cinema. It's so poetic because it's trying to speak metaphorically in a oppressive regime. But I don't think it's that. I think it's the tradition of literature in the Russian sphere and in the Baltics, etc. People were educated more in literature and poetry. The average population was, and therefore poetry wasn't a threat as a
Right.
language, whereas in America, for example, not to be anti-American, but in America there isn't the same
Please.
education around there isn't the same education around literature, and therefore you can't expect, the average member of the public going into the cinema to be fascinated by the idea of poetics.
Yeah, I mean that question of the different sensibilities produced by different contexts
Yeah,
is something that a film like this obviously allows us to really appreciate, hopefully on
yeah,
a global scale, whilst also kind of pointing out the similarities and the serendipities across
yeah.
across
I
across
think
these
so. I'm
peripheral
just thinking as you're
spaces.
speaking there, like in 1987 and 88, i.e., before the fall of the wall, during the perestroika period, I worked quite a lot in the Soviet sphere. I was associate director on a film about Gorbachev, and so I'd been in Moscow and in Czech Republic as it is, or Czechia and Halle and Leipzig, and I went through the checkpoint Charlie. So I tasted the end of that empire. And I remember filming outside the Kremlin, and we stopped to have some lunch, and we were eating sandwiches. And our driver, it was autumn. Our driver went and picked up autumn leaves, orange autumn leaves, and he put them on the windscreen of the car. He pointed to the sandwich and he said, physical food. And he pointed to the autumn leaves and he said, spiritual food. That's a
Mm.
very, that would not happen in a more capitalist type country. This is an ordinary guy, but it comes from a certain degree of like literary education, for example, that we typically found in the Eastern European countries and the Soviet sphere.
Yeah. I mean, let's get into the 80s then, because like I say, I've been lucky enough to watch those
Yes.
2 hour-long chapters about the 1980s. Really fascinating. Lots of stuff I was familiar with, lots of stuff I wasn't, which is as it should
Great.
be.
Great.
Um, and there's so much to get into here, but you kind of frame the first of these chapters around the Berlin Wall
Yeah.
as this kind of it's a very useful endpoint to the 80s and what the
Yeah.
80s represented, and you kind of
I
get.
call I call that chapter "Something There Is That Doesn't Love a Wall."
Oh yes, who's that? It's a quote from a
It's Robert
poem,
Frost. It's a Robert Frost poem.
Robert
Something
Frost poem.
There Is
Yeah,
That Doesn't Love a Wall.
and it's obviously a useful, well, not just a metaphor; it was a real
Yeah,
thing. But
yeah. And I
uh,
was there. I was working in Berlin in October 1989. So it's very close to me, that bit of the story.
yeah, and it's the archival material that you use there is kind of interspersed with footage that you yourself have shot of modern day
Yeah,
Berlin and of these
yeah,
sites like Checkpoint Charlie.
yeah,
And there's a lot in that first episode about the kind of geopolitical context of Reagan and Thatcher in the West versus this sense of crisis, stagnation, and collapse in the East. And you really spend some time getting into this cinema of crisis or stagnation or collapse, but also of kind of emancipation and experimentation in the Eastern
yeah,
Bloc. And
yeah,
there are figures as big as Kishlovsky, who a
Yeah,
lot of people forget was a documentary filmmaker for a long time.
great.
And then there are others who I was not familiar with. There are people who a lot of people wouldn't call documentarians, like the Czech animator Jan Schwankmajer.
Yeah.
So, if just in general terms, how did you approach bringing together the kind of energies that began to animate the Eastern Bloc in the 1980s, and how
Mhm.
did you understand it in terms of the story you were telling in that chapter?
I think it's such an interesting period when you think of what was happening in the West, of course, Reagan and Thatcher and all that. But I remember seeing Joris Podnik's Is It Easy to Be Young? And it's
Mm.
still so fresh. And, you know, do you remember those young people in Latvia in that film? It's about rock concert and things. And they say, nobody gives a damn about anything anymore. So that really captured something about the late 80s in the Soviet Empire. You know, I think that nobody gives a damn about anything. Let's just party. You know, and that was true. There was that, and that played all around the world, that film, as you know, including here in the UK. So part of it was a kind of almost nihilism of those times. But what I love looking at the films from the 1980s is the still so many of the filmmakers are still making a valiant attempt to improve society. You know, the
Mm.
spirit of Gorbachev is hanging around this period. You know, we don't destroy everything we've built. What we built, the machine, the the superstructure of communism in the Soviet era, isn't shouldn't only be entirely destroyed.
I mean, that was the point of perestroika.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
restructuring,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No,
reconstruction.
let's be open. Let's restructure. And there's that kind of qualified optimism in a lot of the films that you see in Latvia and Poland and Czechia and even in DDR, you know, in East Germany, etc. And so I love that. You know, I love the kind of tension of documentary in the 1980s in that period. You know, the life is a mountaintop and a valley of tears and sometimes both in the same film.
I loved one of the figures that I wasn't aware of that I seemed really fascinating. I've got to look it up myself. Is this Estonian director Jak Kilmi,
Yeah, oh, yes.
who makes these? I think actually maybe making films late in the 80s, but about his experience in the 80s
Yeah,
of managing to kind of tune into Finnish TV stations that were showing
yeah.
Dallas, the
Isn't
American
it
soap
fantastic?
opera,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
watching that in 1980s Estonia.
I think, yeah, and you're right. He made that film later than the 1980s, but I put it in the 1980s because it really captures that moment. If you're in Estonia and you're seeing this hyper capitalized, you know, like the Dallas could symbolize the Western world in the 1980s and how it played as kind of entertainment, showbiz, dreamscape for people in the like everybody was drunk and everybody was having sex and it was all about oil and it was fascinating and he really captures the sense of peering over the wall into the capitalist world in all its excess and fun.
And another figure who definitely bears further examination for me is a Czech director, Helena Trestyakova, who
Yes.
makes this really kind of long and detailed, possibly for television, if I've understood
Yes.
correctly,
Yeah.
work called Marriage Stories in the late
Yes.
80s, which kind of is like a sociological portrait
Yes.
of marriage and divorce in what was then Czechoslovakia.
Yeah. And the divorce rate in Czechoslovakia was huge. You know, I come from Ireland. The divorce rate in the 80s was, I think, 4%. In Czechia, it was 40% or 50%, you know. And what Helena Trestikova shows is that it was often about living conditions. You couldn't get an apartment on your own with your husband to raise a family. You had to live with your mother or his mother. The conditions were really cramped, even if you are, you know, a professional, reasonably well-paid person. And so it was like the domestic space that was forcing people apart. And she's brilliant. She's just, I think, made a new film, and she just won a prize in Carlo Vivari for the audience award for her best film. So she's still going strong.
Oh,
Uh,
wonderful.
And when I showed a bit of that film in Belfast, a young Czech woman put up her hand and said, "I can't believe you've mentioned Helena. She taught me, and she was a great teacher of cinema as well." And that's one thing you find a lot in the Eastern European world, that a lot of the filmmakers are also teaching, and that
Yeah.
doesn't always happen in all countries, But so there's a blurring between practice and education, which is very satisfying culturally, I think.
Yeah. And then you also get into some of the crisis moments. I mean, the Chernobyl disaster and
Yeah,
the solidarity strikes in Gdansk, obviously completely
yeah,
different categories of event, but they kind of stand as these two examples of events that seem to symbolize the fall of that Eastern Bloc world, and which also kind of produce this documentary response. I mean, documentary always blossoms,
yeah,
if that's not too flippant a way of putting it, in the
yeah.
aftermath of events like that.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, both those things, Chernobyl and Solidarity, were almost like events in a Greek tragedy of some, like they come along almost like a Deus ex machina to sort of, challenge, shake the world of Ukraine, shake the world of Poland. And it's very inspiring to go. I'm sure you've been to the museums in Gdansk, as I have, and I've been to Chernobyl, etc. And both these, it's wonderful to see the discourse around solidarity and the films that came out of that, and that guy who made, that filmmaker, he's called Vladimir Shevchenko, who went into Chernobyl and filmed the clear up operation,
Yeah.
and it's incredibly moving to see the sparkle on his film footage. And the first thing you think, is that dirt on the lens? No, it's actual particles of film reacting to radioactivity, and it's extraordinary. And of course, he and his team, got very sick and died, relatively soon afterwards. So these are moments that if we were alive, we all remember these two things. We were in the nightly news in the Western world, but documentary was, I think, really rather good at capturing the urgency, the discrepancy of these moments.
And then the other chapter of the 1980s story is centered around this idea of documentarians as detectives.
Yes.
Could you just, this is a really fascinating idea and a selection of kind of figures and films here. Like what do you mean by this idea of detective? I mean, because it certainly isn't limited to the 80s, but it feels like in the 80s there was this
Yeah. When I looked at
rise
the
in
80s,
detective cinema.
yeah, when I looked at the 80s, there's some very famous films like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, like The Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, etc. Michael Moore comes along, and I thought, what if they all
Kazuhara.
Kazuhara, yeah, and that woman Judith Embers in Hungary with her 3 hour film Pox Spectri, which is really fantastic. And I thought, what have they all got in common? And then I thought of that TV show Columbo, and he just pokes his nose. The camera follows him as he goes into places that he's not supposed to go. Marcel Offals is another example. And I thought they're all detectives. They're all gumshoes in a way. They're all poking their cameras into places, industrial sites in Detroit, or, like people living quietly years after Nazism, not wanting to be discovered as collaborators, etc. And so I just thought it would be a nice way of calling them all detective films. And certainly Thin Blue Line literally is such a thing, because it finds that somebody's been wrongfully accused of murder, etc. So I really enjoyed intercutting those very different stories to show that formally the storytelling techniques are quite similar in each case. Follow me. I'm going to ask awkward questions. In the case of Harakazio's, the Emperor's Naked Army marches on, very, very awkward questions about things that we're being lied to about, cover-ups from the past or the
Yeah.
present.
Yeah, it's kind of striking when you think about it in those terms, and when you see in those films by people like Ophuls or Lanzmann or Kazuhara, it took seemingly 40 years before people were able to really ask these questions about the Second World War. We think of the whole second half of the 20th century as being shaped in the kind of aftermath of the war, but it takes kind of 40 years before people are able to or choose to ask those questions, certainly
Yeah.
on film in that way.
And for several reasons,
Yeah.
either because of simple government cover-ups or the shifting of power of the documentary filmmaker. And technological change. Cameras are getting lighter and lighter through this process. You can follow somebody into a room. In the 40s, it was really hard to do that in the 50s. So for technology reasons, for power was changing. Filmmakers were getting more status in society in a way, documentary filmmakers were. And so that's why there's a time lag or a delay. And documentary, right from its earliest years in the 1890s, looked backwards and said, "How did we get here?"
Mm.
And I think the story of documentary film is looking backwards. How did we get here to a point, where we've got the pendulum of the political pendulum swinging right? How did we get here?
And I mean, you go all the way up to the present day, into some recent films, lots of stuff to do with Russia and Ukraine in the 21st century, which
Yes.
is extremely live subject and extremely important work. The one more thing I did want to ask you about before we run out of time here is each of these chapters, which are kind of roughly chronological through the decades, has a kind of key location, and
Yeah.
the key location for the 1990s is Sarajevo.
Yeah.
And you kind of get into the death of Yugoslavia and what happened in that region in the 90s as one of the key kind of themes or stories for the 1990s. And I just wanted to
Yes.
ask briefly, if I can, about Sarajevo as the key location, and what does that stand for you in that first post-communist
Yeah.
decade?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted each chapter to be visually rooted somewhere, so we could return to the place several times. And so, as you say, Berlin and Checkpoint Charlie is a key moment in the 80s. In the 90s, Sarajevo, the Balkan Wars in the 90s were just so awful that I wanted to focus on it. And then in the mid 90s, I was director of the Edinburgh Film Festival, and I got a letter from people in Sarajevo during the siege saying, "Can you come? We're asking festival directors all around the world. We're trying to make an underground cinema. Can you come in solidarity?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." I came from Belfast. I'd grown up in a war, so I sort of, I think I wasn't. So I went, and so I was in the siege of Sarajevo, and I remember the bombs dropping, and I remember having to zigzag from the military plane. But what I learned most about that, when you went to Sarajevo, of course, it was famous that the mosque and the synagogue and the church were all close together. It was a symbol of tolerance and a kind of, mutual regard. In that, the despair was that tolerance was suddenly disappearing. But every night to go underground to a little cinema showing films that were packed every night. People, military and workers and people from all different parts of society during the siege, when there really wasn't enough food, still wanted to see cinema. And I just thought, well, bread and roses, George Orwell, bread and roses. We need food for our bodies, and we need food for our souls. And that's what I learned in Sarajevo. And that's why I focused this bit of the story there visually. I went back to Sarajevo, and I was so moved. They gave me their prize, the Heart of Sarajevo, and standing in front of the audience, the director of the festival said to me, "You risked your life for us." And I'd never thought of it that way. I just thought, I'm doing, an act out of solidarity. And it was at that moment that I started calling documentary a solidarity machine, which I think
Mm.
it is. It allows us to see other lives and understand other lives, and hopefully, therefore, care about other lives.
Well, I certainly can't improve on that, on that framing, that description. And yeah, I think we could do with some solidarity machines for our current moment. So the story of
Yeah.
documentary film will go on. And I think we probably best leave it there for today. There's so much left unsaid, but people have 16 hours worth of wonderful story of documentary film to get into as it starts to be released. But for now, Mark Cousins, thanks so much for joining us and
My
for
pleasure.
talking through the story of documentary film.
Thank you for your time.